Welcome to Novara Live. I'm Michael Walker. Later in the show, I'll be joined by Aaron Bastani as it is a Friday evening. Coming up tonight, me and Aaron will be discussing a Nobel Prize winning scientist who's called out the founder of OpenAI, and former Labour MP Thangam Debbonaire still isn't over losing her seat. She said some pretty wild things about Palestine protesters. First, though, we'll talk through the latest news when it comes to Lebanon and Gaza, and I'll be speaking to Adam Tooze. Israeli strikes last night killed 22 people in central Beirut in the deadliest attack yet on the city's centre. The attack targeted the densely populated Ras El Naba area. An entire building collapsed and nearby structures sustained damage. As I say, it killed 22 people and injured 117. Israel reportedly were targeting Wafiq Safa in Beirut. He's a senior Hezbollah member, sometimes known as Hezbollah's defense minister or interior minister. The attack, which was outside the part of Beirut where Hezbollah have strong support, that's in the south of the city, means that nowhere is safe, as the BBC's Karine Torby explained.
This is a very popular residential area in the heart of Beirut, the capital. Behind me is the site of one of the airstrikes that hit a building. That was a multi-story building reduced to nothing but rubble. And you can see the dust as rescuers and tractors are still, working really hard after very long hours yesterday to remove the rubble and to look whether there is anyone who is still stuck there. The people here, the residents of this building, of this area, the people who are, acquainted to this neighborhood, passers by, they are all in total shock. They stand here, look at this and tell me that they have never, ever in their life imagined that this area could be targeted. This is a very mixed neighborhood between Sunnis and Shia. People here have lived side by side for decades. They know each other by name. They're friends, they're neighbors, and they're also relatives in many cases. And what they saw today, what they woke up to, this site, is really very frightening for them, because in their mind, despite all what is happening, there was still some sort of a framing for all the targetings happening in Lebanon. There were still areas considered safe and others not unsafe. This one was considered safe. This one is an area that received lots of displaced people from other places in the country because they thought this is a place where it is convenient to seek refuge. But today, all of this idea of, the limits between what is safe and unsafe is completely shattered, and people are extremely scared that can be that in everywhere and anywhere, someone can be targeted, and there is nowhere in Lebanon that could be deemed safe.
Meanwhile, Israel has now fired at UN peacekeepers in the south of Lebanon on 3 separate occasions. In response, France has summoned the Israeli ambassador in Paris, and Human Rights Watch has called for an international inquiry. But as events in Lebanon are dominating world attention, Israel is continuing its intensive assault on northern Gaza. Their renewed attack in and around the Jabalia refugee camp has entered its 6th day. And a New York Times piece this week has really shone a light on how the IDF operates in the Gaza Strip. It's really, really horrifying. It's by a trauma surgeon called Feroz Sidwa, who worked in Gaza during this war. And he writes this: I worked as a trauma surgeon in Gaza from March the 25th to April 8th. I volunteered in Ukraine and Haiti, and I grew up in Flint, Michigan. I've seen violence and worked in conflict zones. But of the many things that stood out about working in a hospital in Gaza, one got to me. Nearly every day I was there, I saw a new young child who had been shot in the head or the chest, virtually all of whom went on to die, 13 in total. He says, at the time I assumed this had to be the work of a particularly sadistic soldier located nearby, but after returning home, I met an emergency medicine physician who had worked in a different hospital in Gaza 2 months before me. I couldn't believe the number of kids I saw shot in the head, I told him. To my surprise, he responded, yeah, me too, every single day. Now, that experience led Sidwa to reach out to other healthcare professionals who worked in Gaza to see if they had had similar experiences. And with the New York Times, he polled 65 of them, and these were the results. So out of the 65 doctors, nurses, and paramedics they spoke to, 44 of them saw multiple cases of preteen children who had been shot in the head or in the chest. Only 9 professionals who had treated children in an emergency context didn't witness this. So this is incredibly widespread. One of those doctors gave this testimony. One night in the emergency department, over the course of 4 hours, I saw 6 children between the ages of 5 and 12, all with a single gunshot wound to the skull. Another said this, I saw many children. In my experience, the gunshot wound was often to the head. Many had non-curable permanent brain damage. It was almost a daily occurrence to have children arrive at the hospital with gunshot wounds to the head. And one doctor also provided the New York Times with x-rays of children with bullets in their heads or necks. Dr. Mimi Saeed, who worked in Khan Yunis from August the 8th to September the 5th, said, quote, I had multiple pediatric patients, mostly under the age of 12, who were shot in the head or the left side of the chest. Usually, these were single shots. The patients came in either dead or critical and died shortly after arriving. Now, this is really, really significant, right? Because they're talking about single shots to the head, which suggests sniper fire. Right? If it was the case that this was shrapnel or someone getting caught in the crossfire, you wouldn't be expecting to see lots of people who are, they seem to be suggesting it's especially people being shot in the head or children, preteen children being shot in the head or the chest, which is not suggestive of these are people being caught in crossfire. This is suggestive of sniper fire. Now, if you are having snipers who are targeting preteen children, they are obviously not mistaking these people for militants or threats. They seem to be intentionally killing children. Now, if you're intentionally killing children, that to me makes it seem like the aim here is genocide, right? If you're trying to reduce the population of an area, you would go for the kids. And it does seem like they're going for the kids, right? The survey in the New York Times also found that 63 doctors, nurses, and paramedics observed severe malnutrition in patients, in Palestinian medical workers. So the people who are going to treat these people are also malnourished, and of course the general population of Gaza. All but one of the 65 doctors, nurses, and paramedics surveyed said they experienced severe shortages in hospitals, including basics like soap and gloves. So as I say, this seems like, I think actually the strongest evidence yet that Israel is purposefully killing children in Gaza and purposefully making life unlivable there. I'm sure they would argue that this is, one, I'm sure they would argue that this is all just made up. Two, they might say it's a few badly behaved soldiers. But if you've got all of these medical professionals, and this is not the first time we've heard this, by the way, all of these medical professionals saying this seemed systematic, then it's difficult to see how that would be one or two psychopathic soldiers. It seems to be more systematic than that. And the United States, of course, who are enabling all of this with their essentially unconditional backing for Israel, are still, though, pretending to be the good guys. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken today spoke in Laos, where he said this about the government's priorities.
Something that we're deeply concerned with, which is trying to prevent the conflict in Gaza that started with the horrific attacks of October 7th from spreading. There's also obviously deep concern that we share about the plight of children, women, and men in Gaza, who for now a year have been caught in a terrible crossfire of Hamas's instigation. And for us, this has been a constant area of emphasis, trying to make sure that they're getting the assistance that they desperately need. And we're intensely focused on that question now.
So those are two arguments we've heard time and time again from US officials. They say their key goals in the region are to stop the war between Israel and Hamas from spreading, and then to try and ensure humanitarian support for the people of Gaza. So we're trying our best. Clearly, though, they're failing at both. As I say, the defenders will argue that that's just because the situation is complex. We can't assume that the Americans wanting peace would mean we'd get it. So maybe they want it and they're just, not competent enough to get it or not powerful enough to get peace. Adam Tooze is someone who disagrees. So the economic historian at Columbia has argued this week in The Guardian that the American claim to be trying but failing to keep the peace is just an act. In reality, he says they are exploiting crises in the Middle East and also in Ukraine to advance their strategic interests. I spoke to Adam earlier today and started by asking him who he was arguing against, or in other words, who was it that's propounding the idea that the United States is merely feeble?
The quasi-official mouthpiece for this is the New York Times, right? Which has produced a series of seemingly very well-sourced articles, all of which long read form, which basically are centered on leaks from within the White House about how Biden, is spitting mad at Netanyahu and swearing and totally frustrated with their inability to get the Israelis to do anything that they want them to do. And the implication being that they would like the Israelis to sign up straight away to ceasefire or moderate what they're doing. And then the more highbrow version of it is Ezra Klein's podcast, where he's actually been thinking in a very explicit way for 6 to 12 months now. Ezra Klein is, the New York Times most influential political commentator and has this huge podcast. Folks should listen if you want to get an idea of like where mainstream American opinion is on the liberal side. It's, you need to listen to Ezra Klein. And he's had people like Haas on, formerly of the Council of Foreign Relations, which is the establishment think tank of foreign policy in the US, in which they've been talking about the need for an independent US foreign policy. The implication being that right now, basically, Washington is being yanked around by, on the one hand, Ukraine and Zelensky and their determination to fight the war towards what increasingly seems like a dead end, and on the other hand, Netanyahu and Israel. And so the two versions, one is a sort of colorful story about tantrums in Washington, and the other one is a strategic question about where is Americans' foreign policy, imply that there's something missing. And I guess the thought experiment of the Guardian piece, and obviously it's a little bit more than that, but it started with a question essentially was, well, what if we actually view this a different way? What if we actually see these pieces as concertedly tied together? And not in the sense that I think that the United States or Biden was at all interested actually in the escalation in either space, because I think the Biden administration is interested in an escalation via China. That idea is in fact quite well socialized and not even denied, I think, in high places in Washington, that the United States is a revisionist power with regard to China. Originally, that implied that they were trying to stabilize or at least calm situations both in Eastern Europe, which I don't even think they thought was an arena, and the Middle East, which they knew was. But the contention would be that as events have unfolded, as Russia's aggression became manifest, and then October the 7th and the Israeli reaction, essentially the Biden administration have found ways of instrumentalizing this, functionalizing this, have rethought, I think, their assessment of the global situation, and have moved the US onto a front foot position of basically a more proactive, high-tension strategy in three arenas at once. So in Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and in the South China Sea with regard to China. And that, I think, is at least consistent with the evidence and consistent also with some of the less highly touted stories that we're getting out of the Biden administration about the influence of a much more hawkish, neoconservative global war on terror kind of strain of US foreign policy thinking.
I think when it comes to Ukraine, it's quite understandable what the US might gain from their policy, whether or not it's right or wrong. They see that there's a country which is fighting one of their adversaries, Russia. They can sort of give them lots of arms, and it will be Ukrainian bodies on the line, so they don't have to pay a political cost there. But also, quite importantly, with the Ukraine-Russia example, they can say, we're actually on the right side. We're defending the good guys. Russia mounted this illegal invasion and illegal occupation of Ukraine, and we're there to support them. With the Israel-Palestine situation, most of the world is not looking at this thinking is that the Americans are siding with the good guys. And two, it's a bit less clear who the adversary is and why it matters so much. I mean, obviously it's Iran, but they're putting a lot of effort into backing Israel, taking a huge political hit. Is it really worth doing all of this to change the situation in Iran somewhat, or to weaken Iran? Does that make sense?
In each case, you also have to ask what's the alternative, right? And another reason why backing Ukraine is really a no-brainer from their point of view is that allowing Putin to win a large conventional military success in Europe is risky from the American point of view. With regard to Israel, I think you just have to discount global public opinion, right? That just doesn't matter, doesn't feature in the decision-making circles here. They're bewildered that people don't get on side with them, but they're not interested in it. They're not responsive to it. That's not a consideration. There is really an identification of the interests of the United States with the Zionist project, which is utterly explicit in the person of Biden, right, who is on record as saying that he thinks that Zionism isn't just something for Jewish people, which is also logically correct. Zionism obviously is an ideology quite separate from Jewish identity, and he's a proud Zionist. So that's one key element here. The kind of the damage it does to global standing is just not a concern. I think what's really rung a bell for me is that aside from the Iran dimension, where I agree you could do a kind of cost-benefit analysis, and I think it's true when you get the stories out of Washington that they actually have a back channel to Tehran. They're communicating quite closely with them. They're orchestrating the tit-for-tat responses such that this doesn't escalate. Nevertheless, I think, and this would be the point I would add, I think there is a strain of US Middle East policy thinking, and it's centered on these two figures, McGurk and Hochstein. I think that's the right way of pronouncing his name, who are really the fixers in the Middle East space, because Middle East didn't have top priority in the Biden administration, right? Sullivan is the big brain behind the China policy, and Blinken is the Atlanticist guy running Ukraine, which is deeply, very much on the president's mind. And so Middle East was delegated. It was delegated in part because it was problematic, because Biden had taken this strong anti-Saudi, anti-MBS position. And his people have to walk him back from that because they realize that if you're going to do realpolitik in the Middle East, you need to do business with the Israelis. You need to do business with the Saudis. And what Netanyahu wants most in the world is normalization with the Saudis. And so that is the direction they've been pushing in. And all of this is a long, over several decades now, digestion within the US policy world of the experience of 2003, and then ISIS, right? This is crucial. McGurk, I think, sees Hamas and Hezbollah, and it's a total confusion, but in his mind, terror is terror, and dealing with terror involves crushing these two actors, and that is, as it were, where the conflation happens. And so, though I agree from a classic cost-benefit kind of analysis of what you might need to do to contain Iran, this is obviously overkill. They don't underestimate the degree of influence they have over Israel. So the question is, do you let this dog run, right? Do you let this dog bark? Do you let this force play out? And I think this is why I refer to this as like a controlled demolition. I think that's what Israel is doing for them.
McGurk, is he someone who's in the State Department? Sorry, I wasn't familiar with this particular figure.
A policy leader on the Middle East. There's a great piece of background on him that you should link to perhaps in the notes for this segment. He's the survivor, really the cockroach he's described as of Washington policy, because he was in the Bush administration, in the Obama administration. He was running the anti-ISIS program even under Trump for a while, and has now come back under Biden. So he's really a red thread figure of US policy, even more than a figure like, say, Kurt Campbell, who's been doing Japan, China, South Korea for his entire career. So there are these figures who are one step down from the Sullivan-Blinken level, who have huge influence because they're regional experts and embody a kind of consistent line of policy. And he has a Twitter feed people can follow, and it is straight down the kind of anti-terror line. And I think that's shouldn't be underestimated as an element tying this all together.
To draw this out a little bit more, there's three positions really. I'm sure there's more, but I'm going to lay out three positions now in terms of what the Americans are doing. And the one you'll hear from Biden and sort of Biden's liberal supporters is to say that the American administration has been put in a very difficult situation. It might not always be acting perfectly, but it's doing its best to try and stop this escalating out of control, or in the case of Ukraine, to sort of try and deter Putinist expansionism. Then, especially when it comes to Israel, there's this sort of second position, which is this is not in America's interest. They don't really want to do it, but the Zionist lobby is quite powerful, and There's real ideological sympathies within the White House. And so they're happy to let it all happen. You know, that maybe they'd prefer Netanyahu not to do a genocide in Gaza, but they're not that fussed about it. And so they're happy to go along with it. And then I suppose there's this third position, which you seem to be sort of angling towards, which is it's not just that they're tolerating it, it's that they actively think this is good for American interests. That what is happening in the Middle East, it is good to allow Israel to sort of do as much damage as they possibly can to the Palestinians in Gaza, to completely destroy Hezbollah and probably, you know, create a civil war or something along the lines of state collapse in Lebanon, and then create instability in Iran. That's actually not just something to tolerate, but something to celebrate in a way. Do you see the sort of the distinctions I'm making, and does that make sense to you?
I think I quite like your distinctions. I think the difference might be that I'm not sure they want to celebrate anything, right? I mean, I think they have quite a dark analysis of the world, and especially Putin's aggression against Ukraine was a huge shock for the Biden administration. I think there's very convincing on-the-spot reporting of just how difficult it was for them to wrap their heads around the possibility that this was actually going to happen, right, as an actual assault. So I think what Washington is trying to do is decide how dangerous is this world. And they start with the sense that the main challenge is China, and that's fearsome and a huge historic challenge. And then Putin's assault goes in and they realize, oh my God, we're dealing with a much, much more dangerous world than before. And then the Hamas attack reminds them that there is this just entirely unresolved issue of the Palestinian question, whilst they've been trying to do the normalization. And so it isn't that they're celebrating so much as they're saying to themselves, okay, there are this series of really deep fundamental challenges out there. And in the form of Ukraine and in the form of Israel, we have allied actors that are willing to spill the blood and do the dirty work of addressing these challenges. And then the historic moment of opportunity rhetoric kicks in, which apparently is quite powerful for McGurk and Hofstein, which is you don't get the chance to do this, right, all over repeatedly. You can't just, in general, decide, right, we're going to try and eliminate Hamas or destroy Hezbollah as a real force. Now the opportunity presents itself, and then as a decision maker, the entire logic reverses, because then at that point, if you don't act, right, you're missing an opportunity. This is, I think, was very powerful with Ukraine as well. Look, an opportunity presents itself to massively attrite Russian force. How could we, we couldn't look ourselves in the mirror unless we took this risk. Of course, it's risky, but that's in the nature of this kind of decision making. So I would think it's in that kind of manner, not celebratory, but a kind of grim determination to see this through as an opportunity that needs to be taken advantage of. And it's a way of avoiding what I think is a really unhelpful kind of construction that says this is clearly against America's interests and therefore Zionist ideology is driving it, or the clearly apologetic line, which is that we're a bunch of herbivorous human rights respecting folk liberals here who've just, trying to make the best out of a bad situation. I think it's something much closer to this vision of historic opportunity and a relatively dark assessment of the overall balance of power. And so the tightening Tehran-Russia link, which is real, and China's increasing significance in the Gulf, which manifested itself, for instance, in Beijing's brokering of talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia. All of this puts them on the defenses, which is why in the piece I refer to the US as revisionist and kind of draw a line to Trump, because I think all of this reflects, and this willingness to take risks reflects an assessment on their part that the broader flow of history is not running necessarily in the US direction. So this is an aspect, an assessment which would differ from the position of the early 2000s, where I think deep down the neocons were convinced that, the forces of history were broadly on their side. And so it was time to just accelerate that and to use any means necessary to do so.
I want to focus in on Gaza. You mentioned sort of the New York Times earlier as sort of the mouthpiece of this idea that Biden sort of wants to respect human rights if he can. He's maybe sometimes happy to sort of go against them, but he'd prefer, other things being equal, to sort of be a proper liberal, let's say. Also in the New York Times this week, there was a piece where they'd sort of surveyed 65 doctors who had been working in Gaza, and the vast majority of them said that they had treated multiple preteen children with bullet wounds to the head and the chest, which these doctors quite reasonably, I think, assumed meant that they'd been killed with snipers. And this, to me, reading this, I was like, this does seem to be the clearest evidence that it's an intentional genocide. It's not a war with sort of elements of genocide. If you're actively killing children, it seems like they just want to eliminate the population of Gaza. And I mean, I suppose I want your thoughts on what you think Israel's war aims are and how those are being seen in Washington, because it is, it's clear that the maximalist aim for Israel is to empty Gaza. I still don't really see how that's possible, and I don't really see what the Americans are thinking about this. So I kind of want you to sort of help me make sense of this in a way.
It's absolutely horrifying, those accounts which began to come out, didn't they, about a month ago, of the doctors' reports of these clearly deliberate sniper attacks on children. I don't know whether you infer genocidal intention from that, but clearly what you're talking about there is an unhinged conduct of war by the IDF. I don't think we should be too rationalist here. I'm not sure that we should impute to either Israel or the US anything even remotely like a coherent vision for the aftermath or the future. And that was what I was also trying to get at when we were talking about this on the podcast last week. We ask questions like, can Gaza recover, or is there going to be reconstruction? And that would imply that there was a step-by-step grand vision, and I just don't think that's there. I think in the US, the two-state solution is still routinely invoked, and if you prod Biden people and ask them, so what's the plan? What's the plan? That's what they'll tell you, and they'll trot it out, even though at this point you can't find anyone in the region itself, I think, that actually believes that's an option, and regardless of what's going on in the West Bank at the same time, right? So I think there's cognitive dissonance of a really massive kind. We shouldn't underestimate that. Rather than the bumbling through, if you told me your basic theory about the Biden administration was massive cognitive dissonance, I'd have much more sympathy for that as a position. But I don't think that, we all function with degrees of cognitive dissonance all the time. So the question is, how does your cognitive dissonance resolve itself? And in this case, it's this combination of the de facto support of mass murder and gross violation of international law, combined with this sort of clinging to shreds of an old 1990s rationale, which on the ground are being systematically sabotaged. And of course, we shouldn't underestimate the agency of the Israelis and Netanyahu's very long-term plan, I think, to unhinge the two-state-based solution. But then you ask them, what's your vision? And they don't think they have a coherent answer, which is why the Israeli opposition is so indignant. It isn't out of exaggerated concern for the Palestinians. It's because they can see that this doesn't lead anywhere. My answer to you is I'm not sure one can give a coherent account of that. It resolves then into, well, let's destroy and eliminate Hamas. And then everyone can kind of applaud and say, well, yeah, clearly we agree about that. But then you say, well, how will you do that? And the answer is there is no way. And so this is why this labeling of Hamas and Hezbollah as ISIS equivalent, which I think is part of what's going on in the Biden administration, is so disastrous. Because if you do that, then we all agree, of course, you can't negotiate with ISIS. That would be impossible, even though we know perfectly well that behind the scenes throughout that conflict, there were a variety of different contacts from a lot of different actors, which did involve negotiation with ISIS. But when you say it out loud, it's unspeakable. So we don't. So I think that's the kind of impasse that we're in. And I understand why people want to resolve that into a truly horrendous, dark vision of pure genocidal intent. I think I get it, but I'm not sure whether that's a realistic vision. I'm part in saying this, of course, because I spent a lot of my early career studying the operation of the Third Reich, and I'm not making a simple analogy here. I don't think it's helpful, but I feel like I've been here before in trying to make sense of logics of annihilation which escalate, and they don't necessarily do so because you have a clear step-by-step vision, and then in retrospect, it makes sense in a tidy-minded way to say, well, that happened because of this original plan.
That was Adam Tooze speaking to me earlier today. Adam has his own podcast. It's called Ones and Twos, spelled Tooze, so his surname. I really do recommend it. Last week's episode, which he referred to in that interview, was on the war in Gaza 1 year on. Artificial intelligence pioneers John Hopfield and Geoffrey Hinton have been awarded this year's Nobel Prize in Physics. We've spoken about Geoffrey Hinton before on this show. He developed the neural network systems that formed the basis of large language models like ChatGPT. But last year, he left his job at Google to speak out about the dangers of artificial intelligence, and he repeated some of those concerns by telephone as he accepted the Nobel Prize.
I think it will have a huge influence. It will be comparable with the Industrial Revolution, but instead of exceeding people in physical strength, it's going to exceed people in intellectual ability. We have no experience of what it's like to have things smarter than us, and it's going to be wonderful in many respects. In areas like healthcare, it's going to give us much better healthcare. In almost all industries, it's going to make them more efficient. People are going to be able to do the same amount of work with an AI assistant in much less time. It'll mean huge improvements in productivity, but we also have to worry about a number of possible bad consequences, particularly the threat of these things getting out of control.
It was a really, really interesting press conference in that it was really quite somber, right? More somber than celebratory, I thought, even though this was a gentleman receiving basically the highest award you can possibly get in physics. He said he was surprised to get the award for physics because he's actually been, I suppose, a computer scientist for most of the years of his life. But clearly, the Nobel Prize, I think this is very, very relevant within physics as well. In that press conference, Hinton was asked if, given his concerns about AI, he regrets making the inventions that won him the Nobel.
There's two kinds of regret. There's regrets where you feel guilty because you did something you knew you shouldn't have done. And then there's regret where you did something that you would do again in the same circumstances, but it may in the end not turn out well. That second kind of regret I have. In the same circumstances, I would do the same again. But I am worried that the overall consequence of this might be systems more intelligent than us that eventually take control.
So as I mentioned earlier, it was Hinton's neural networks that paved the way for large language models like ChatGPT, which is developed, of course, by OpenAI. But in another press conference on his Nobel Award, Geoffrey Hinton took a swipe at OpenAI's founder.
I'd also like to acknowledge my students. I was particularly fortunate to have many very clever students, much cleverer than me, who actually made things work. They've gone on to do great things. I'm particularly proud of the fact that one of my students fired Sam Altman. And I think I better leave it there and leave it for questions.
So Geoffrey Hinton seems to be a fairly straight talker. The student he was talking about who fired Sam Altman was Ilya Sutskever. He was the former chief scientist at OpenAI who voted with the board of that company to fire Altman as CEO in November last year. They did so because they didn't think he was being candid in his communications about the company. And the move was seen by people like Geoffrey Hinton as a win for AI safety. However, though, and unfortunately, if you're coming from Geoffrey Hinton's perspective, the move backfired. Microsoft offered to hire Sam Altman and the rest of the staff of OpenAI. OpenAI's staff then revolted against the board, and Sam Altman was reinstated with even more power than he had before. Hinton was asked later in that press conference, so the one celebrating his Nobel Prize, about his thoughts on Sam Altman.
So OpenAI was set up with a big emphasis on safety. Its primary objective was to develop artificial general intelligence and ensure that it was safe. One of my former students, Ilya Sutskever, was the chief scientist. And over time, it turned out that Sam Altman was much less concerned with safety than with profits. And I think that's unfortunate.
So the idea of Sam Altman as someone principally interested in profits goes against what he's always claimed in public. So he said this in a congressional hearing last year.
Okay. You make a lot of money, do you?
No. I paid enough for health insurance. I have no equity in OpenAI.
Really?
Yeah.
That's interesting. You need a lawyer.
I need a what?
You need a lawyer or an agent?
I'm doing this because I love it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator Kennedy.
I do it because I love it. All it gives me is enough for health insurance, and I'm happy just to do it for the warm feeling it gives me, for the intellectual curiosity. I'm not about the money. However, Sam Altman does seem to like the money. Last month, Reuters reported that OpenAI was set to remove non-profit control of the company and give Sam Altman equity worth $10 billion. And on a recent episode of The Joe Rogan Show, we don't show you many clips of The Joe Rogan Show, but this one I thought was very entertaining. He mocked the idea that Sam Altman wasn't interested in the cash.
Do you know Sam Altman? He's always the head of OpenAI.
Yeah.
He's always kind of said, I'm not doing this for money. I don't make any money. And they just busted him in a $4 million Koenigsegg.
They did?
Yes.
Oh, that's awesome.
You see if you can find that car. The video of him in that car. Oh, I don't need money. But money? I'm not even interested in money. He's driving around a $4 million Koenigsegg.
God.
Look at it.
Oh,
see,
my God.
Go back to the beginning so you can see him get in it. Does it show him get in it? No. That's him in his fucking... Yeah. Elon was mocking him. Look at that. Got a $4 million car. There he is. Hi, busted.
Hey, bro.
I think you like money. Look, you don't buy one of those unless you really want to get rich.
So a funny clip, but this is actually pretty worrying, right? You've got a Nobel-winning scientist who invented AI technology, or this particular type of AI technology, saying it's really, really dangerous. We need to be really, really careful. However, it so happens that the most powerful person in control of that technology looks to be out to get rich, and, I think this is just as worrying, seems to be fairly comfortable with lying. Right? He said that to Congress. His behavior seems very different. And testimony from a former board member at OpenAI adds further cause for concern.
For years, Sam had made it really difficult for the board to actually do that job by, withholding information, misrepresenting things that were happening at the company, in some cases outright lying to the board. At this point, everyone always says, like what? Give me some examples. And I can't share all the examples, but to give a sense of sort of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, it's things like, when ChatGPT came out, November 2022, the board was not informed in advance about that. We learned about ChatGPT on Twitter. Sam didn't inform the board that he owned the OpenAI startup fund, even though he, constantly was claiming to be an independent board member with no financial interest in the company. On multiple occasions, he gave us inaccurate information about the small number of formal safety processes that the company did have in place, meaning that it was, basically impossible for the board to know how well those safety processes were working or what might need to change. And then, a last example that I can share, because it's been very widely reported, relates to this paper that I wrote, which has been, I think, way overplayed in the press. The problem was that after the paper came out, Sam started lying to other board members in order to try and push me off the board.
So, Aaron, how worried are you about this? I mean, for Geoffrey Hinton, winning a Nobel Prize, right, doesn't get more serious than that as a professional accolade. And he used his, essentially his acceptance speech to talk about his concerns about this one particular individual. And are you worried that there's this situation whereby there's this new technology, the guy who invents it thinks it could be incredibly dangerous? It feels a bit like Oppenheimer with sort of the nuclear bomb. And the guy in charge of this seems to be fairly comfortable with lying or misleading people and, wants to get really, really rich. This seems to me like a bit of a recipe for disaster.
Have you seen Terminator 2, Michael?
I think I've seen Terminator 2. I always get confused between which one's which, but yes. Is that the one where he goes down into the sort of lava and melts?
That's right. That's right. Yeah. And you've got that character, Miles Dyson, who is, of course, the inventor. He's the mastermind behind a certain microprocessor, which will lead to Skynet and Judgment Day and the downfall of humanity and the war by machines against our species. And of course, Arnie and Sarah Connor and John Connor, they go to get Miles Dyson and to kill him, but then they explain to him what's going on. And of course, Miles Dyson, he blows up the technology with himself. He lets them get away in a moment of, ethical martyrdom. This is effectively Miles Dyson in our world, Michael. It's Geoffrey Hinton on Zoom. That's the controlled explosion of Mars Dyson and Terminator 2. Not quite so Hollywood. But it has a certain parallel to it, doesn't it? Somebody who is behind a hugely disruptive technology, recognize the political, technological, social implications of what they're doing. Machine learning, deep learning, which is a form of AI, it's the thing that Geoffrey Hinton's talking about, it's the thing that is powering ChatGPT, is immensely disruptive. You don't have to believe in the idea of a superhuman intelligence, as Hinton hints at there, right? That could happen. You don't have to believe in that and the idea that that is going to create existential threats towards humanity to be very concerned about the implications of AI for all of us. Mark Cuban in 2017, owner of the Dallas Mavericks, US billionaire, he's on Shark Tank, their equivalent of Dragon's Den. He said the world's first trillionaire will be the person who masters commercial applications for impressive AI. And I think that's correct. The world's first trillionaire will be somebody who really gets to use AI with regards to things like accountancy, with regards to medicine, with regards to all kinds of pattern detection, education. There are so many fields. There is so much value to capture, from driving to journalism, Michael, generative AI, machine learning, all these things which fall under that umbrella are going to capture so much value. Now, you might think the world's first trillionaire. Don't be silly, Aaron. Elon Musk is worth around £250 billion. I think Bezos is north of £200 billion. Of course, if you look at the world's most valuable companies today, they're worth about a trillion plus. There's 4 or 5 companies which have been valued at more than a trillion at one point or other. Apple is one of them, of course. I think Meta now is up there. It's certainly north of 500 billion. I think it's now around a trillion. If you'd said to Aaron when he was 10, 30 years ago, I'm an old man now, Michael, I'm 40. If you said to me in 1994, there'll be companies where, you can contact anybody anywhere on earth using your laptop, and you can share photos, you can share video, there'll be loads of ad revenues, and the companies themselves will be worth $1 trillion plus, I would have said, what on earth are you talking about? So I think fast forward 30 years, the idea of people being worth $1 trillion plus on the back of AI might seem outlandish to us. It's no more outlandish than the world of Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg to somebody 30 years ago. And that is why people are in this race for AI. It is about value capture. It is about revolutionizing, capsizing, disrupting dozens of industries at a time. Walk down a high street. How massively has it been affected by online retail? Amazon. Some places in this country have been absolutely destroyed by it. Now imagine the same kind of impact, but writ large to, like I say, dozens upon dozens upon dozens of industries with the rollout of commercial AI, particularly machine learning. It would have massive, massive implications. And so the idea that this kind of technology would fall into the hands of a select group of people is troubling, even if you don't believe in the possibility of an existential risk, which, by the way, Geoffrey Hinton does. He's eminently qualified to believe that risk is plausible. So, in short, AI is a hugely important disruptive technology. The idea that it can be in the hands of just 1 or 2 individuals should concern all of us. And we need to take seriously as well, regardless of ownership, the politics of this stuff, because it's going to create a lot of unemployment and it's going to create a lot more inequality, both income and regional. You look at how much California has gained with the internet revolution of the last 30 years. I mentioned all those trillion-dollar companies. I think California has 3 or 4 trillion-dollar companies based in that state. Not Amazon, but Meta is based in California. Tesla was, of course. It's now moved. Apple is based in California. There's other ones too. I think maybe Nvidia. Many companies based in California or the United States, and they're sucking money from the rest of the world, millions upon millions of dollars crossing the channel every week, every month, whether it's to go to Amazon data centers or whether it's going to Instagram, via shopping ads. It's all being sucked into the US and specifically California. I think California now accounts for 50% plus of all venture capital across the whole of the United States. Really extraordinary story. This is a state of around 40 million people. So AI really matters, and I think, as Hinton's basic point gets at, we need to be thinking about the politics of this and not just allowing our plutocracy to get even worse. Because if you think it's bad with Musk, with Bezos, You ain't seen nothing yet. It'll get a whole lot worse with AI.
Yeah, because I mean, there's two arguments, isn't there, with AI? There's one that it's going to increase inequality, and I think that seems to be very, very likely. The other, which I think is what sort of Geoffrey Hinton talks most about, is that it could create an existential threat because sort of sci-fi scenario essentially where the AI manages to dominate us because it gets more intelligent than us. So he says, that there's never been a more intelligent or a less intelligent sort of being that gets dominated by that manages to dominate, a more intelligent being. So if this AI gets smarter than us, we can presume that after a while it will end up dominating us. In a way, that's a bit beyond my levels of comprehension as to how plausible that sounds. But I see lots of people sort of saying, oh, it's just PR hype. It's just these AI companies that want to sort of pretend they're more significant and powerful than they are to inflate their stock values. Now, Geoffrey Hinton is 79. He's a professor at a university. I don't think he's saying this to boost the share prices of certain AI companies. So I really do take his warning seriously. By the way, he's suggesting not so much to slow down the development of AI, but he wants governments to force AI companies to invest loads and loads of money, like a big proportion of their income, into researching AI, so that it's not all happening behind a black box, so that we can sort of keep an eye on what's going on and try and get ahead of the risks. As I say, somewhat above my pay grade, sort of the extent to which we need to be worried about these risks, but given someone like that thinks we do, I'm personally not too relaxed about it. At the general election, Thangam Debbonaire lost her seat as the Labour MP for Bristol Central. Now, that was in part because she went along with her party in not supporting a ceasefire in Gaza. She was defeated by Carla Denyer of the Greens. Debbonaire, though, is still defending Keir Starmer. She said this on a Channel 4 podcast about Labour's first 100 days in power.
I find it extraordinary that anybody thinks that yelling at the Labour Party is helping people in Palestine, because it is not. And it's not empty gesture politics. It's not helping people in Lebanon. And I find it really extraordinary that people would think it does.
It's really interesting to hear you explain that in the way as if us having a go at our own government is pointless in this situation, or as if it doesn't go anywhere. Because I can tell you, having worked with many UN ambassadors over the last few years, that actually the UK taking a strong position and voting, actually they've abstained on lots of votes in the UN, they've voted with the US, and actually banning all arms sales, especially as things have escalated, would send a really important message to the world, a really important message to Israel and Netanyahu in particular, and an important message as well to the US, who, you think very
the US
slow
is
to
going
react.
Take messages from the UK?
Well, I think
the UK, the total proportion of arms sales to Israel by the UK is tiny.
Well,
it is minute.
No, it isolates the US to being the only one of the few countries still supporting.
I think they're fairly confident being their own country.
So I remember this from when Labour were in opposition. They were saying, why are you making a deal? Why are you complaining about us? We're not even in government. What influence do we possibly have? Now they're in government and she's still saying, there's absolutely, why would we bother to do anything about this? What influence do we have? Now, after Iran fired those rockets at Israel, Keir Starmer stood in front of two big flags and said, this is completely unacceptable. Why would he bother doing that if he thought Britain had no influence? Right? If you really think that Britain can't have any influence whatsoever in the world, then just shut down the Foreign Office, right? Just say we're going to be isolationists, right? We're going to give up our seat on the Security Council, because what's the point in having it if you don't think you have any influence on world events whatsoever? If you want to be isolationists, fine. Let's say, fine, we're a small country. We're going to be a bit more like Norway, let's say. A country that doesn't get too involved in international affairs and sort of accepts that it's not this massive player. That's not what we do as a country, right? You've got Keir Starmer standing up there sort of saying that he's going to be this really significant force. We must stand up to Iran. We must stand up to Russia. He's clearly someone who thinks Britain can be influential. But the moment it comes to Israel, he's like, oh, no, what could we possibly do? Why are you even protesting us? This has got nothing to do. There's nothing we could do. Aaron, it just strikes me as incredibly, pathetic. And when we're talking about sort of a situation where, as we were talking about earlier, sort of the New York Times talking about children being intentionally murdered, essentially, sort of sniper fire to the head. And then you've got a Labour, just this completely dishonest, immature argument. It's almost sort of criminally pathetic.
Isn't it funny? If you want to influence political outcomes by giving away freebies, goodies, Taylor Swift tickets, please go ahead. Be my guests. But if you want to influence political outcomes by protest, collective action, getting organized at the local level in somewhere like, Bristol or London or Glasgow, don't you dare. How could you? That won't make a difference at all. If only people who wanted Israel to stop waging its war on Gaza and Lebanon, if only those people could afford to get Taylor Swift tickets for Thangam Debbonaire, maybe she'd change her tune. And your point about British influence is so spot on, Michael. The idea that we're so impotent and so powerless. We were involved this spring in stopping Iranian projectiles hitting Israel. So not the most recent attack by Iran, the one prior to that, the Royal Air Force, alongside the Americans, the French, the Jordanians, they were scrambled to stop projectiles hitting Israel. So we are involved. Oh, well, we barely sell any weapons to Israel. That's true. 99% of all hardware, military hardware that's purchased by Israel is being manufactured by German and US companies. 100% true. But we still do a heck of a lot of business with Israel. And we are America's closest ally, major ally in Europe. Britain's on the Security Council, as you said. We have nuclear weapons. I think we have a military defense budget of about $60 billion plus a year. But we can't do anything. The same politicians who talk about the special relationship and how we can influence, the US, we have special pull in Washington. The minute you say, well, you have special pull, can you please do this? Can you do something which might be vaguely inconvenient for you personally? Oh, we can't. I'm afraid we can't do anything. We're just little old Britain. Okay, well, we magically managed to occupy Afghanistan for decades. We invaded Iraq. We were involved in attacks on Libya, Syria. We talk about regime change all around the world. Okay, there's one thing. Can you get involved in? We can't. I'm afraid we've got no power. Well, hold on. You were involved in getting rid of Gaddafi and Saddam Hussein and getting rid of the Taliban. There's one other thing. You've done all that stuff over there. There's one thing over here. Sorry, I don't know what you're talking about. That's basically people like Thangam Debbonaire on Gaza. Why? Because it's personally and politically inconvenient for them. And I get it. You don't like people shouting at you. I get it, right? Not nice. But like you say, Michael, children being shot in the head by snipers is also not nice. People do it because they're seeing horrific things every day, every hour, frankly, on social media. And they want to stop. And uniquely, yes, Britain is not China. It's not the US. It's not even Russia in terms of geopolitics. But it's still a leading power. It's still got all those things we talked about, nuclear weapons, Security Council, along with France. It's a major European power. So of course people should be seeking to influence their politicians to shift policy on this. Of course they should be. Israel wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Britain. Israel would not exist. From the Balfour Declaration to the Mandate of Palestine being overseen by the British Empire, Israel would not exist. So the idea that we can just wash our hands of it and that we have nothing to do with it and no influence and sorry, just vote for me but don't ever come complaining. Well, people in Bristol worked that one out and they gave Thangam a good hiding. She lost by about 10,000 votes in the end.
Peter Harrison has pointed out that I probably chose the wrong country as an example of if we wanted to sort of step back from the world, because Norway has participated, he says, in 40 military adventures since World War II, including the bombing of Libya in 2011. Norway actually has long been sort of a very enthusiastic NATO member. Of course, Jens Stoltenberg, so sort of currently the head of NATO, is a Norwegian. I probably should have said Sweden, I suppose. Keir Starmer ends his first 100 days in office almost as unpopular as the government he replaced. 59% of the public now disapprove of the new government compared to only 18% who approve of it. We've, of course, talked a lot on this show already about Keir Starmer's unpopularity. We won't just rehearse all of those same arguments. But the YouGov poll also, and this is very interesting, has polling on the main policies Labour has adopted. So when it comes to, so this could explain, why it is they become unpopular, or it's probably more to do with freebies and the like. But policies of the Labour government that people like, 61% agree with new pay deals with striking doctors. So they like those pay rises for doctors. Keeping the 2-child limit on welfare benefits. So our viewers might be disappointed to learn that 57% of the public approve of that. So actually, Labour's second most popular policy, unfortunately, 28% disapprove. Lifting the ban on building new onshore wind farms in England, very popular. Suspending some arms sales to Israel, very popular. Of course, we think that didn't go far enough. Scrapping the previous government's Rwanda plan on immigration. Again, we're getting here, it's a bit more divided, but the plurality thinks that's a good idea agreeing new pay deals with striking train drivers. Actually, the plurality there, disapprove, but not, it's pretty much 50-50 there. Handling of the riots, pretty much 50-50. And then the unpopular ones, what Labour have done that people really don't like, 55% of people disapprove of them making pensioners' winter fuel payments. Means tested, only 34% approve. And at the bottom there, releasing some prisoners early in order to avoid jail overcrowding. People really don't like this. 68% of people disapprove of this, only 21% approve. I'd say that bottom one is a little bit unfair on the Labour Party because they didn't really have a choice. That was a Tory thing. Aaron, it is, I think tomorrow, isn't it, going to be sort of the first 100 days of Keir Starmer. Any of these sort of polling on policies surprise you? Do you think this gives us much insight into Labour's woes?
Well, you've only got 4 policies there, Michael, which are a net positive popular. And actually, they're things that Labour's kind of not really wanted to do. One of them is, of course, ending the sale of some arms to Israel. Yes, hugely popular with the doctors and nurses. You know, if you looked at Twitter and you looked at the media, you'd have no idea that's the most popular thing they've done. No idea at all. But people, A, think that those professions should be earning more money. B, they know, rightly, by the way, that it's a necessary first step to reducing NHS waiting lists. Look, the first 100 days, this idea of a first 100 days of government, it comes from Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, in the US. He wins an election. He enters office in 1933. You've obviously had the Great Depression. US wages over the previous 4 years had fallen about 50%. I think new house building had fallen by about 80%. However bad do you think Britain is in 2024? It ain't nothing on America. In 1933, straight away, dozens of new laws are implemented. And it's about 3 months later that FDR says this first 100 days has been a really frenetic period to turn this country around. Now, what has Keir Starmer done in his first 100 days? I appreciate you have obviously the summer recess and so on, but what's he done in his first 100 days? I appreciate some Labour supporters will say, well, there's these graphics on social media and they promise to do this and commit to it. We get promises and commits. What's he done? What laws have been passed? Some good things, by the way. Okay, public ownership of rail, great. Pay settlements with regards to train drivers and with regards to NHS workers, great. Some other stuff too. But the things that are out there in the popular consciousness in terms of the first 100 days of Keir Starmer, £32,000 worth of free suits, talking about the former government, and that's basically it. Free gear Keir, which is obviously not FDR-esque. And my goodness, Michael, this country needs an FDR. I think people, when they voted for Labour, they wanted somebody who was a person of action, decisive, affable, personally charismatic, of course, willing to work with others, cooperative, and has some original ideas to help this country turn itself around. We had that report from the IFS. We talked about it on yesterday's show, basically saying this country has had the most abject 20 years possible when it comes to things like productivity, when it comes to living standards, unprecedented in the modern era. People know that, they see it. Leave their front door, they see the high streets, they see that HMOs being crammed onto their terrace street because people aren't building new houses elsewhere. They see all that, they know all that, the state of the roads, the state of the NHS, and they want some original thinking. So like I say, decisiveness, person of action, affable, charismatic, original thinking. Does Keir Starmer fit any of those? I don't think so. So we are in this unique situation where somebody who, frankly, isn't that attuned to politics, isn't particularly good at politics, doesn't really have many ideas about what he wants to do with power, has more MPs behind him on his side than Margaret Thatcher did after 79, 83, or 87. He has way more MPs than she did. He has a significant amount more than she did. His majority is not quite up there with Blair after 97, but it's not too far off. So we're in a very strange moment, Michael, of people being ambivalent about Labour. You know, there was a brief window of hope and optimism. You even see that in business confidence. It picks up after July. A fresh broom, let's see what they can do. But then misery guts Keir, who has no ideas and can only talk down the country, can only talk down his own party very often, can only talk things down. And he's not a very, bubbly guy when it comes to his own offer either, has managed to depress the country once more just in time for Christmas.
I've been corrected once again in the comments. Pepe Soulful says Stoltenberg is no longer head of NATO, by the way. And he is correct. I'm wrong by 11 days because 11 days ago, Stoltenberg His term ended and he's been replaced by Mark Rutte, the former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. I think is he the current Prime Minister of the Netherlands? The former Dutch Prime Minister. Thank God. Let's end this show now before I get anything else wrong. Aaron Bastani, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Pleasure as ever, Michael.
Do you know who the current Prime Minister of the Netherlands is? Just a little quiz question. I don't.
It was the person that was being proposed was some person that obviously was just going to be a puppet for Geert Wilders. Originally, they were from the Social Democratic Party. I don't know if they got the job. But look, Mark Rutte has been the Prime Minister of the Netherlands for so long. It's one of those things, isn't it? It's like Merkel in Germany. Obviously German Chancellor Scholz, but the Netherlands slightly less important. Very tall man, Michael. There's a picture of Rutte next to Keir Starmer, and the Dutch are very tall people. Very tall. I think the tallest people in the world.
I just Googled it. The current Prime Minister of Netherlands is called Dick Schoof. It's an interesting name. Thank you everyone for watching tonight. Have a fantastic weekend. Come back on Monday. And we will see you then at 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.